Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, Telling Your Story for a Public Policy Purpose. My name is Luke Byram, and I am a board member on the CASA project. This is the second webinar in a series sponsored by Family Voices, National Center for Family and Professional Partnership, in collaboration with the Autistic Self Advocacy Network, Kids as Self Advocates, and Youth Move. Today, you will hear from Reid from the Autistic Self Advocacy Network. CASA is a project of Family Voices focused on youth leadership and advocacy. The project oversight is provided by a small group of youth and young adults who serve on a volunteer board. The board is currently seeking board applicants, and we are particularly interested in youth and young adults from diverse racial and cultural populations. The lines will be muted, and they will be muted until the end of Reid's presentation, where we will then welcome questions, but please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box that will be monitored, and Reid will address as many questions as possible at the end of the call. Now let's welcome Reid.
Thanks, Luke, and welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Reid Caplan, and I work for the Autistic Self Advocacy Network, or ASAN for short. The mission of ASAN is to make sure that autistic voices are at the table anytime that autism is being talked about, because we think that there should be nothing about us without us. And that's a major theme in what I'm talking about today, which is sharing your story for a political purpose. And doing this doesn't just apply to autistic people, it applies to everyone, but it can be especially important for disabled people. So moving on, why should you share your story? And going a little bit back, even just in the title, what does a political purpose mean? So let's talk about elected officials. Elected officials are people who, everyday people vote to work in the government. So when you vote in an election, the people that win the elections are your elected officials. And what elected officials do is they make policies, which are rules or laws that you make to solve problems. And then, so the way that elected officials come up with policies is talking to the people that elected them, because if they want to keep getting elected, they want to help fix the problems that people bring them. So by sharing your stories with them, that can help them make policies that can solve the problems or the issues that you care about. This is really important for people with disabilities because many times decisions about us are made without talking to us and without hearing how we feel about problems. So by learning how to share your stories, it helps make sure that when new policies are being made that will affect disabled people, that disabled people and their feedback will be considered in the policy-making process. So who makes the laws? So for this presentation, I'm going to be talking specifically about the federal government, meaning the government for the whole United States. But a lot of what I'm talking about also applies to state governments and local governments, so governments for your city or town. But for the federal government, Congress is the part that makes the laws. And Congress has two parts, which is the Senate, which is senators. There are 2 senators for each state. And then the House of Representatives, those people are called the representatives. And the amount of representatives is different for each state based on how many people live there. So you want to share your story you need to think about the important parts of a story. So, number one, what policy are you looking at? So there may be a problem that's come up for you and people that you know, and you want your elected officials to do something about it. Or there may be a policy, a new law that's come up that your elected officials may be voting on, and you want to talk to them about why that policy may be good or bad. So you want to be very clear about what the problem is, because if you're not clear about that, your elected official is not going to know what you want when you go to talk to them. The second thing is, how does that policy relate to your life? So when you go and talk to an elected official and talk about a problem, they want to know how it affects you, because you're the person that's coming to talk to them and you're the person that is voting for them. So they want to make sure that it's affecting you specifically, and sharing those personal details helps your elected official make that connection. As in, oh, I know this is a problem, but now I know people that are actually affected by it, and that might make them think differently in a way that they hadn't thought about before. And number three, what is the goal of sharing your story? So you want to know before you even start talking to your elected official what the ideal situation would be. So if an elected official is going to vote on a law, if you want them to vote one way or the other, you want to know that's your goal and create your story to help lead your elected official to that conclusion. So by sharing your story as something that's a problem, they know, oh, the solution is pass this law or don't pass this law. So you're always aiming for that goal. So every story has the same general structure when talking to an elected official, regardless of where you're talking to them. So that structure, you always want to start with your name and address, because they need to know who you are, and knowing where you live, or just the city where you live, is very important, because they want to know that you live in the place where people who vote for them live. And then knowing the problem. As I mentioned, you have to identify your problem so that your elected official knows what you're talking about, and also why that problem is important to you, as I mentioned earlier, and going into a little bit more detail, how that problem affects your life and how the problem affects other people. Because it can't just be you, because the policy is to solve a big problem, a problem that affects a lot of people. So if it's just something that affects you, then going through this really long process of making a law, the elected official is not going to want to do that. So they're going to want to know that it affects a lot of people. Then going into ways the problem can be fixed. So after talking to you, your elected official knows what to do next if they want to help you. And then ending with an ask, a question or a request. So you can end by asking, what are you going to do to fix this problem? Or you can end by asking, please do this to fix this problem. And that leaves the person you're talking to with a very clear next step. So more than just following that structure, you want to make sure people will remember your story, because elected officials hear from a lot of different people. And so they may forget some of what you say, or you may not be meeting directly with the elected official. You may be meeting for someone who works for them that will report back to them about what you say. So you want to make sure that you make your story really noticeable. And the way that you can do that is by making your story short and direct, because if you add too many little details, they're not going to remember the main idea of what you said. So you want to make sure that it's short enough so that whoever you're talking to will remember everything. You want to make your story personal to you so that the person you're talking to can remember, here's this person that was talking to me. They shared these details about their lives that are unique, and that's why I'm going to remember them. In the same idea, having enough details. So even though you're keeping it short, you still want to have little details about the problem or the solution that you want to make, so that the person you're talking to can remember that main idea. And then, as I mentioned, showing that a problem is big, because a problem has to be affecting a lot of people before an elected official is going to want to make a policy around it. So where can you share your story? There's a lot of different places, and we're going to go into a little more detail about each of these. So phone calls, in-person meetings, emails or letters are the big three that a lot of people use because they can be a little bit easier to get into and they can make a really big difference. There's op-eds, which is writing in a newspaper or magazine. Town hall meetings, legislative testimony, and public comment periods are getting a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk about those as well. And then there's social media like Facebook and Twitter. So finding out where you can share your story, even though there's all of these different places, finding out, so let's say you want to find out when a town hall is happening. We'll talk more about that, but you need to know where to look to find out that information and what time you need to go to wherever the town hall is and what will happen at the town hall and things like that. So you can look at websites of your elected officials. That's where you can find the phone numbers and email addresses of your elected officials if you want to call them or email. You can look at websites of nonprofit organizations who will usually have a list of people that they would like you to contact about a certain problem. You can look at social media pages there's ones for elected officials, there's ones for nonprofit organizations. There's just groups of people that all share an interest that may post about these things. You can also look at newspapers. And for things that are specific about disability, if you're interested in sharing your story as a disabled person, you can look at your state's Developmental Disabilities Council, Protection and Advocacy Center. Usually these are called Disability Rights Your State, but if you just look up Protection and Advocacy Center Your State, you'll usually be able to find it, or any other disability rights organizations that you know. So starting with ways that you can share your story, phone calls is the one that people talk about a lot because making a lot of calls makes a big difference because if you're talking to someone on the phone, they have to listen to what you're saying because you're directly talking with them. And a lot of people can make calls at once. So if you're calling the office of an elected official about a problem and all your friends also call that same office, it's going to be really hard for anyone in that office to get any work done because their phones are just going to keep ringing and ringing. So that can make people pay attention when a problem is a big deal. We'll notice because a lot of people are calling about it. So elected officials may have more than one office. Usually for federal, like the senators and representatives, they'll have an office in Washington, D.C., and then they'll have an office wherever they live. So like the senator of California will have some offices in California and then one in D.C. So you can call all of the offices that they have, but if you have to choose just one, choose the office that's closest to where you live. And before you call, you should prepare a script so you know what you want to say. All of the phone calls go basically the same regardless of what the problem is. The person on the other line will ask who you are and where you're from and what exactly you're calling about, and all you have to say is, hi, my name is your name, I'm from your address, and I'm calling about this problem, and then just talk a little more about the same story structure that we talked about why you think it's important and what you would like your representative to do. So some people can't talk on the phone, and that's all right. There are other ways that you can still use a phone, and that's just as effective. So you can use a text-to-speech device, like an iPad with an app that you can press the buttons to make it speak. And then you can write up your message beforehand, and you can play it over the phone. And so you can still give the person on the other line that same information without having to actually talk. You can also have someone talk for you. When they call in, all they have to say is, I'm calling in behalf of this person. So you can just write what you want to say and then have another person read it for you. If you're anxious about talking to a person, you can also call after the office is closed and leave a voicemail message. Usually they would be closed after 5 p.m. on the weekdays and they're closed on the weekends. So you can call and they do check their messages. So leaving a message is just as important as if you were making a phone call during the regular office hours. So meeting in person with an elected official is really important because it helps the elected official understand that there's a face to this problem. When you're seeing someone in person, it can make you understand where they're coming from a little bit more and that a problem is important. Not everyone can do in-person meetings. We understand that it can be really hard to arrange a meeting, but if you can do it, it's a really great thing to do. We recommend that you try and make any appointment to meet with an elected official at least 2 weeks before you want to meet, because they have to make their schedule very far in advance because a lot of people want to meet with them. So you need to make sure that you can fit it in. So how should you prepare for an in-person meeting? You should ask how long the meeting will be when you're making the meeting so that you know how long it will be, so you can prepare all of the information ahead of time and know what you can talk about. If it's shorter than you thought it should be, then you may have to cut a little bit of what you wanted to say, but it helps you prepare. So deciding what clothes you want to wear is also important because you want to look professional when you're walking in. So you want to dress nicely. So you can wear a suit or a nice pair of pants and a button-down shirt, or a dress, or a skirt and a jacket, any sort of variation of that. Of course, make sure that you're comfortable, but it's a sort of professional setting. I know because I've been to these offices and everyone is in a suit, so it can be kind of intimidating, but just try your best with that. You should definitely research the problem you want to talk about, because in some cases, when you meet with someone, they may not know everything off the top of their head about the problem. So you might ask them, well, like, I came here to talk about this problem. Do you know about it? And if they say no, you don't want to not know what you're talking about. You may have to explain it to them. So make sure that you know a lot about the problem. You also may not be meeting with your senator or representative or elected official directly. As I mentioned, this is the case for all of the examples I'm talking about. A lot of times the elected officials are so busy that you will meet with a staff member instead, and they will report back to the elected official. So of course the staff members also are very busy, and so they may not have the time to research every problem. So you also want to print out any handouts or pictures that you want to bring with you, and then you can give them to the person that you're talking to, and they'll make sure to keep that information. Also try and arrive early for the meeting, because it shows that you really care that you show up there early, and you may get a little more time if the other person who was before you finishes early as well. What should you do during a meeting? Be ready to answer questions. As I mentioned, the person you're talking to may not know that much about the problem you come in to talk about. So always be ready. Don't raise your voice or argue, even if you disagree about a problem. There are a lot of times where you go to talk with an elected official and they don't always see eye to eye with what you have to say. But if you start arguing with them, they're probably just going to get angry and not care about what you're saying. So a good thing to do is listen to what they have to say and then say, I understand where you're coming from, and then bring it back to what you're talking about and why you feel what you're talking about is important. And after a meeting, you should always send a thank you email, because it helps the person you were talking to remember that you went in and talked to them, and just shows that you appreciate their time. Moving on to emails and letters, in the same way that phone calls can make a big impact, the more letters or emails that are sent, the bigger the impact is, because it shows that a problem is really big, that so many people are writing or emailing about it. Letters tend to be more effective than emails because imagine just a stack of papers being dropped on a table. That makes a bigger impact than seeing an email inbox full of emails, because you can delete the emails pretty easily, but it's a little harder to get rid of all those letters. You can also fax a message. I'm not sure, not as many people use fax machines nowadays, but it's a way to sort of type something up like an email and then get it sent directly to the elected official's office, where it will be printed out at a fax machine. So this is also a good thing to do. It sort of combines emails and letters into one. So moving on to op-eds. An op-ed is a story written for a newspaper, magazine, or a website, and people usually write op-eds about a topic that's been in the news already. So if you read your newspaper or a magazine that you like and you see an article about a problem that you care about, you can go usually within the newspaper or at the magazine's website. There will be a place where you can submit your own op-ed. And so you write an op-ed like you're writing a letter. And it's a letter to the editor. So you'll write, "Dear editor," and then write what you want to say about a problem. Different newspapers or magazines will have different rules about what can or can't be in an op-ed. So you should always look at the specific news source to get those guidelines before you start writing your op-ed. But these can be really good because a lot of people read the news. So a lot of people, if you submit an op-ed, will see it and learn more about that problem or policy that you care about. Moving on to town hall meetings. Town hall meetings are held by members of government to hear from everyday people. So this is sort of how you would imagine a bunch of people in a room, and at the front of the room facing everybody is the elected official or one of their staff, and people sort of raise their hand and ask questions, or can go up to the front and ask a question, and then the elected official will answer it. So there's two types of town hall meetings. There are general meetings, which you can talk about any problem you want. The elected official is just there to hear from everyone about whatever is important to them. But there's also specific town hall meetings, which are if you want to talk about a specific problem or policy. So if there's like a certain law that's coming up to be voted on, there may be a town hall just so the elected official can hear about that law. So be sure to check before you go about what town hall it is. And each person doesn't get that much time to talk to the elected official because these town halls can have a lot of people there. So make sure that you write down what you want to say beforehand and that it's very short. I'd recommend under a minute in total what you want to say. So you can use that same template for the story structure, but just shorten it a lot, take out some of the details, and make sure that you ask a question at the end so that your elected official has to respond to what you said. So moving on to legislative testimony, there are meetings called hearings that the people who make laws have to learn more about a bill before they vote on it to become a law. And legislative testimony is when you go to a hearing and tell the people who make laws about how a law will affect you. This is a chance, it's a lot more formal than a town hall, so there's not as many people that get to talk at these, but it's a really good chance to get a lot of elected officials in a room at once, so you can impact a lot of people at the same time. So what should be in your testimony? Because testimony is a very formal process, the structure for it is a little bit different. So you have to start the same way with a story with your name and where you're from, but you also have to say the name and number of the law just so that they're sure that you're talking about the same law that they're thinking about. Then you say what you think about the law. You can put in the same details like you do with the regular story template. And then at the end, you want to sum up your main points in one sentence so that everyone there can remember your main idea. That's what you leave them with. And then you should always thank them at the end for listening to you. How should you prepare for a hearing? Your testimony should always be written down. You never want to go up there and not know what you're going to say. You should print out your testimony, bring it with you. If you can memorize it, that's great. If you need to read it from the piece of paper, that's also fine. And you should print out as many copies as you know people that will be there. So when you look up when the hearing is happening, it will say here are the elected officials that will be there. So you want to count how many and print out as many copies. And then there will be a staff person there who you can give the copies of your testimony to, and they will give one to each elected official. So that way, even if you don't get to finish what you want to say, they will have your comments, your testimony, on a piece of paper to look at later. The way that testimony works is that you have to sign up beforehand. So you have to arrive pretty early before the hearing even starts to sign up. Each person gets about 3 to 5 minutes to talk to give their testimony. So you should try and find out the exact amount of time that you have, because if you go over time, they may cut you off and have to move on to someone else. And even if you do sign up, you may still run out of time and not be able to give your testimony, but that's okay because you printed out copies, and you can still give those copies to all of your elected officials even if you don't get the chance to talk. So during the hearing, you give your testimony in front of a group, so you can see the picture over there. That's one way that testimony happens. So you may get a little stage fright, that's okay. That's why we really recommend bringing your paper up there with your testimony on it, just in case you need to read it. And after your testimony, the legislators, the people who make the laws, may ask you questions. If you know the answer to a question, answer it, but if you don't make something up, because you want to make sure the information that they're getting is accurate. So if you ask a question, and if they ask a question and you don't know, you can tell them that you don't know and offer to look up that information and send it to them. And if that happens, be sure to do that, because that's a good way to stay connected with these elected officials and to get them the information that will help to make their decision about the law. And as I mentioned earlier, time may run out before you can give your testimony. But either way, if you come prepared with the paper copies, that shouldn't be a problem. So public comment periods are what happens after a law is passed. So a law passes, but it may not have the details about how the law will be put into place. So let's say a law passed that said we're giving $1 million towards healthcare, but then they need to figure out, so what part of healthcare is that $1 million going to go towards? Are we going to give $100,000 to 10 different things? Are we going to give $1 million to one part of healthcare? So making those decisions, those specific decisions, those are called regulations. And people can give their opinions on regulations that are being made during something called a public comment period. So a little more about public comments. Public comments are submitted online. There's the website. You can see the picture of it called regulations.gov. And using that website, you can look up the name of the law that was passed and see the regulations that are being made. And sometimes regulations can be written in language that's kind of difficult to understand because it is a legal document. So let's say that the regulation is about the environment. You can ask nonprofit groups that are working on the environment or any other people that are interested in the environment to help you figure out what the language is saying. And the same with laws and regulations that are about disability. You can ask any disability rights organization to help you figure out what it's saying and write up your comments. Social media is not something that you really use to talk with your elected officials, but it's a really great way to connect to other people that care about the same problems that you do. The biggest two social media websites are Facebook and Twitter. We're not going to go into too much detail on how to use those today, but I have some resources at the end that you can look at to learn more about how to use these. But the way that people use social media, they can make groups to talk about problems that are important to them or to organize things. So let's say you want to make a phone call to your elected official to tell them about a problem. You can post on Facebook or Twitter and tell people that's what you're going to do and get a group of people together and all call at the same time. So by using social media to organize what you want to do, you can make a much bigger impact than if you were just doing it by yourself. So we talked about the different methods you can use to share your story, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about strategies on how you can make the most impact doing all of these things. So one thing that's really important when you want to share your story is making things routine so that you're always looking for chances to share your story, and so that you can help other people who want to share their story. So one thing that helps me is to choose a day each week that you can check a newspaper or social media or the organizations that you care about to look for chances to share your story. You can also work with your friends to make sure each of you stays involved. You can choose a day and time to check in with your friends or your family and say, what did you do this week? What problems have you noticed this week? Can you think of any chances that we have that we can share our stories? You could also get involved in a local organizing group. There are groups for any problem that you can think of. There are other people that are going to care about that problem. And working in a group can be a really effective way to get a lot of voices at the table at the same time. And also, working together can make sure everyone stays responsible. And so, for example, if you're in a group, the whole group is checking in with each other to make sure that you're all doing good work. So that helps you stay on top of what you're doing. So as I mentioned, group work can be really great because the more voices, the better, and you can get work done more quickly. But group work can be hard sometimes because not all of the group members may agree on what they want to do. So there may be arguments within the group, or certain group members may not be doing their share of the work. So that can also be kind of frustrating. So here are some tips for group work to make sure that those things don't happen. Be consistent. So that means if you're a group that meets to talk about what you're doing, make sure that the meeting time is always the same and the meeting place is always the same so that people don't miss the meeting or get confused about when it's going to be. Or if you're a group that meets online, make sure all of the information you want is available in the same place so everyone knows where to check. Divide up tasks so nobody is left doing too much work. You should ask each group member about what they want to do, because if you give a group member something that they really don't want to do, the chance that they're going to do it or they're going to do it well is less than if you gave them something that they really like doing. So find out what each person's strengths are and play to those strengths. And then work together to make sure everyone's voices are heard. So there may be some people in the group who are a little more quiet or may not know how to share their story right away, but you want to create the space so that everyone has the chance to share your story. So just be sure to think about that as you're working with your group, because if someone feels like that they don't have the chance to make their voice heard, they won't want to be a part of the group. And so that can also mean that certain people who are not so good at one thing but are good at another thing can work with someone else who is better at the thing that the other person is not so good at. And they can work together to help each other and make sure that they both get heard in the conversation. Keeping the momentum going, sharing your story can be difficult. Again, it can be hard to sort of keep moving forward and keep sharing your story over and over. But a good way to keep that momentum going, number one, is always send a follow-up letter. So as I mentioned earlier, like when you send a thank you letter to your elected official after you meet with them, sending that follow-up letter is not only a way to have the elected official remember you, it's also a way for you to remember what you've been doing and to sort of have a chance to write it down and summarize for yourself, here's what happened and here's what I hope to happen next. Let other people know when you share your story. So you could post on social media that I just talked to my elected official about this important problem to me, and that lets other people know what you're doing. It may inspire other people to share your own stories, and then you can help each other afterwards. And also remember that there are so many different ways to share a story. So you may try sending an email to your elected official and not hear anything back. And that can be really frustrating. But that's not the only way that you can connect with your elected official. You can talk to them on the phone. You can go meet with them in person. You can go to a town hall. You can give legislative testimony. There's so many different ways, and your voice really matters. So don't get discouraged when one way doesn't work, because there's so many opportunities out there, and you really can make a difference. So self-care is what it sounds like. It's basically making sure that you take care of yourself. Sharing your story can be stressful, especially when you're talking about things that are really important to you in your life. It can be really difficult being a person with a disability and taking the time to share that story with people. So you want to make sure that you take time for you if you feel yourself getting too stressed out. So adding time to rest or relax into your routine is important. So the same way that we talked about earlier, taking one day to look for chances to share your story, you should also take some time to rest and not look for chances to share your story, just to have that time to yourself and do the activities that you like. So relaxing activities can be anything, but some things that really help people that I know are watching movies or playing video games, doing art or writing poetry, or do what the panda in that picture is doing and go out in nature and just relax. Another good strategy is to find people who are good listeners and ask to talk to them about how you feel. So people that maybe they can either be also involved in what you're doing, or they could not be involved in what you're doing. Whatever you feel will be more helpful to you, but just having that time to talk about how you're feeling can really help you, and they may have advice and things that you haven't thought about before on what to do next. So I talked about earlier some resources relating to sharing your story. So some of the topics that we talked about today are in our Civic Engagement Toolbox for Self-Advocates. That resource talks a little bit more about making phone calls, sending emails and letters, and having in-person meetings. And the other topics we talked about today are in a toolkit that we haven't yet released, but that will be coming out very soon, and I will make sure that we give that resource out so that you're able to access it. But for now, please feel free to take a look at the toolbox. And there are also resource guides from our Pacific Alliance on Disability Self-Advocacy. Those guides go into a lot more detail about the process of making a law, how the government actually does it. And there's also an in-depth guide about social media and how to use it. So that could also be helpful to you. So that is my presentation. If there are any questions, now would be the time to ask them.
Thanks, Reid. That was a wonderful presentation. And I want to invite people to either, I think, Aya, were you going to unmute their line so they could ask those questions verbally, or you're welcome to chat your questions into the chat box.
The leader has unmuted your line.
Well, I'm not hearing any questions. Just give it another minute here and see if anybody wants to either share a comment or a question or has any thoughts about the presentation, other strategies that you've used that you'd like to share.
Yeah, and if
Hi,
you,
this is.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Katie Smith from the Peel Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we serve the center. We serve the state, and I'm the youth leadership person. And I just wanted to say that you gave a really nice, in-depth presentation, and I really liked what you said about sharing with asking others what you've done this week and what issues have you come across to help find advocacy issues, because it's not always easy to find those or figure out what really connects with you. And we do a lot of encouraging our youth to share their stories to create impact for others and inspire others. So this was a really great webinar. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. I just saw a question in the chat that says, do you have any tips for overcoming the social anxiety that may accompany speaking on a personal subject in public spaces? So I also have difficulty with this. The thing that helps a lot of people is really writing out what you want to say before it happens. So making sure you're as prepared as you can be can help you sort of like get a good handle on what's going on around you, and feeling like you have control over the conversation can help with anxiety. And also, it's sort of a practice thing. The more that you share your story, the easier it will get. And so it may help to start with some ways of sharing your story that aren't revolving around speaking to a large group. So you could start with just making a phone call or sending an email, or you can start with doing a one-on-one meeting with someone. And then as you get better at those things, you can move on to doing things like speaking at a town hall or giving testimony. So just pushing your comfort zone a little bit, but starting small and working your way up is also a good strategy.
That was a really good question from Emily, because I think that is true for lots of people. A lot of people have anxiety about presenting, speaking to their elected officials, and then if you also deal with social anxiety, that's even tougher. So Reid, this is Beth Baker, and I just wondered if you could share any examples of the kinds of issues that you brought to the attention of public officials.
Okay. So I can talk about one issue specifically that I went to Capitol Hill and talked with my representatives about. It was a few years back, and there was a bill on the table that was about using restraint and seclusion in schools. So, for example, putting a disabled student in a locked room by themselves. And this bill would have made it much more difficult for teachers to do that. They would have had to have very specific reasons for why they did it, and they would have had to write those reasons down and submit them so that it wouldn't happen as much, because it's like, in my opinion, that's a really bad thing to happen. Students shouldn't have to be scared that that's going to happen. So I went to my elected officials and shared a story of when I was in school and that happened to me and how it affected me. And I felt that was a really powerful experience, and that the people, the elected officials that I talked to, never really had a chance to talk to people that had happened to. So really, your perspective is really important, because there's not that many people sharing these kinds of stories so publicly.
That's an excellent example. And you're right, a lot of times, officials or our elected officials are really looking for examples so that they can use those to make their point. So you're giving them information, sometimes educating them, and other times giving them examples that they can use to push something on the floor. So good example, Reid. Any other questions? Either chat them in or you can share them auditorily. And again, not just questions, but comments and other strategies that you've used, or resources that you're aware of. Some good comments in the chat box. I want to reinforce the request to provide feedback on this presentation. So there's a link at the bottom of the slide that's showing now, and it says you can click here to provide us feedback on this webinar. That feedback is really important to us. We use that to improve future webinars, to know what works well for people and what doesn't, so we appreciate your feedback.
Yes, and anyone can feel free to email me directly. My email is on the slide if you have any other questions or comments or want more resources relating to this.
And I have provided the link in the chat box too, so another way to access the evaluation for this webinar. Well, hearing no further questions and seeing no further questions in the chat box, I think we're ready to conclude this webinar. But I want to first thank all of our participants for joining today, and a particular thank you to Reid for his presentation today.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening.